Today, I want to talk about herbalism that is interwoven into everyday life in Latin American culture that helps support our cycle and hormonal health. To set the scene, I first want to talk about how menstrual health is seen in many South American countries. My experience as a Colombian growing up in the US is that menstrual health wasn't really talked about. I did spend a couple of years in high school in Colombia, and I don't recall there being any type of education around it. It's something that half the population experiences, but it's something that is kept between you, your mother, your grandmother, and your tias. Many times it's something that isn't really talked about until the day of your first period at menarche. And then it's kind of mentioned that you are now a woman, even though the average age of people getting their periods is 12-year-old kids. This lack of education and at times even menstrual products leads to something that is called period poverty, where the idea that periods are taboo gets reinforced, especially because of the religious dynamic that many South American countries still have. And while conversations around menstrual health and education still have a long way to go, our culture does offer us a lot of herbal wisdom that is interwoven into everyday life that does help support our cycle and hormonal health. The reason that we're talking about this now is because hormonal imbalance and cycle irregularities have become more common, which I think comes from a combination of different things like a more sedentary lifestyle, a broader focus on optimizing and biohacking productivity, and just living in a hyper capitalistic society that doesn't leave time for rest, meals, or community in general. Those internal and external stressors then leads to things like more painful periods, hormonal acne, more cramping, and just PMS in general. One of the ways that we can focus on our own general well being, especially for our hormonal health, is through things like herbalism, especially when we see herbalism as interwoven into everyday life, like through our cooking. And that is where I think Latin American herbalism really shines. Funny enough, I've been studying herbalism for about 7 years now, and it hasn't really been until the last 2 years that I've even focused on herbalism in Latin America. A lot of our more mainstream herbal knowledge comes from a more Eurocentric perspective, which, while helpful, I found that it's very easy to get into the mindset of use this herb for that situation, that issue, and then using the standalone herb, so usually in a tea or a tincture, to remedy that. While in Latin American culture, herbalism is interwoven into different recipes and meals, and it's not really not thought as supporting your health, even though it is supporting your health by being interwoven into the recipes already. So now let's go over some of my favorite Latin American hierbas and see how they can help support our hormonal health. All right, starting off strong with cacao. Now, most people wouldn't think of cacao as being an herb, but it does come from nature, comes from a tree. The birthplace of chocolate is roughly about 5,300 years ago in the areas that is now Colombia and Ecuador, which while I was researching for this video, I found it super interesting is that they just recently discovered this. Previously, it was thought that the Mayans were the ones that kind of helped bring cacao into the general population. But through different research into different compounds of cacao, specifically the theobromine, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But because of that very specific compound that's specific to cacao, they found out that it was actually earlier than that. I think it was like 1,000 years earlier that different peoples, indigenous peoples in the Amazonian rainforest were actually using cacao already. Some of these indigenous people used the cacao as currency, and others thought of it more as being a gift from the gods, placing cacao drinks in the center of different celebrations and rituals. Today's cacao is made into hot chocolate and is enjoyed throughout Latin America, and each country and each region can add different spices like cinnamon or cloves to it. It is enjoyed throughout the day as a snack or as part of a balanced breakfast. Right, so now let's talk about some of the benefits of cacao. I'll be including some of the modern day research as well as traditional knowledge because I find that there is a good balance between both. And a lot of the times, research really just kind of helps validate what indigenous communities and knowledge already knew, which I find that super cool. So cacao is packed with flavonoids, and these flavonoids really help support our cardiovascular system. And they help support our blood pressure, they help the blood flow that goes to our brain and to our heart, and they also help prevent against blood clots. Other flavonoids can help with insulin resistance as well as helping in how your body metabolizes sugar. Now, this part here is really interesting to us because when it comes to insulin sensitivity and blood sugar regulation, that is something that can definitely impact our hormonal health and hormonal balance. Having repeated blood sugar spikes over time can lead to higher levels of estrogen as the body is storing these extra glucose, extra sugar, as fat in fat cells. These fat cells are then able to produce estrogen. So having hot chocolate is a really good way to have something that is semi-sweet. That way you are getting that craving whenever you are craving something sweet, as well as helping your body better metabolize sugar. Another really amazing thing about cacao and hot chocolate is the mineral content to it. So, starting off with magnesium. So, magnesium is an essential mineral to our bodies. It is involved in something like 300 different chemical reactions in the body. So, you could say that it is super important that we get enough magnesium. Some of the areas that magnesium is used for is for our muscle and nerve function, which is something that we want to note here because during our period, our muscles, so the smooth muscles that surround our uterus, are contracting. And they do this to be able to shed the uterine lining. And what magnesium does, it helps relax those smooth muscles so that they are better able to contract. Because if they're always tensing, so one, this is a lot of cramps as you can imagine, but also it's not able to actually like release the lining. What we want is for them to relax and then be able to squeeze more efficiently. That way we are able to shed the lining with not as much pain, which is the ideal. It also helps minimize muscle spasms that are being caused by overly sensitive nerves. Low magnesium levels have been linked to an increase in feelings of anxiety and irritability, and it also plays a major role in your body's response to stress. And magnesium has an interesting relationship to stress because as our body is impacted by different life stressors, that depletes our magnesium levels. And because we have low magnesium levels, we have higher instances of stress. So there is kind of like a relationship between magnesium and stress and how stress is depleting our magnesium reserves, which are already as a cultural pretty low. And cacao is rich in magnesium. It has about 65 milligrams of magnesium in a cup of hot chocolate. It is also high in iron, with about 5 to 10 milligrams of iron in about 3-ounce servings, which, if you think of hot cocoa, you're having more than 3 ounces. I like to have a couple of cups of hot chocolate during my period to get my iron levels back up, but also as like a comforting treat during that time. This is especially important if you're having heavier bleeds that can over time lead to anemia, which is low iron levels, because you are losing more iron than you are reincorporating back into your body. Some important things to note when buying cacao is that you want to opt for the one that has less sugar. You can either make your own hot chocolate or check out the Latin Hispanic section in your local grocery store and you'll find these like hot chocolate tablets that you then just put into the milk and they make an instant hot chocolate. Different brands come from different countries and regions, so they'll vary in taste by the different spices that they use. Something else to note is that cacao can be stimulating. It does have a little bit of caffeine in it, and it also has theobromine, which we talked about in the beginning when we were talking about how they figured out when in like recorded history that humans first started to use cacao. So theobromine is a very specific compound to cacao, and it is slightly stimulating. So if you are feeling a little bit more anxious, maybe use a little bit less of it, or just kind of first experiment and see how your own body reacts to it. So if you are sensitive to caffeine, you might be a little bit more sensitive to it. I am sensitive to caffeine, but I think it's because like I've incorporated hot chocolate into my everyday life. I don't notice if it does make it more like if it makes my anxiety worse or not. Usually I'm having it in the middle of the day or in the morning. It's not really like a late at night treat. So it is something that you can then experiment with. And then the final thing to note is that when you are choosing cacao, you do, especially when it comes to like chocolate bars, you do want to be opting for fair trade and just sustainably harvest. Cacao does have a history of child labor and just deforestation because of the high demand of cacao. And hot chocolate itself, it's kind of hard to see if it is fair trade, sustainably harvested or not. But when it comes to chocolate bars, that's a lot easier to track. So kind of opting for that whenever possible. All right, next up is an equally as popular herb in Latin America, and that is hierbabuena, also known as spearmint. Now, when I was looking into the history of hierbabuena and kind of like where it originated from, I couldn't really find a concrete answer. There were some sources that said from Asia, others from Europe, others from Northern Africa or the Mediterranean. What we do know is that at some point it was brought over from Europe to Latin America, where the warmer climate really helped it flourish and expand throughout Latin American culture. And this is one of the few herbs that is used as like a standalone herbal tea. And interestingly enough, you use mostly fresh herbs versus dry. So I feel like here in the States, we are a little bit more familiar with using dry herbs. So dry herbs that we then put in jars and then we're able to put them in water and use them as tea. But with yerba buena, you usually see it more fresh. So I've even gone to different coffee shops in Colombia and they would have, when they give me the tea, it's with fresh leaves because a lot of people have it in their gardens, in pots in the house, because that kind of speaks to how popular it is to have yerba buena in recipes and teas, and we'll get more into like that in a little bit. Now, traditionally, it has been used for all types of digestive distress. So, indigestion, gas, stomach cramps, intestinal irritability, and this effect on the muscular system does go beyond just the digestive system because it can also help other muscles in the body, notably to us, is menstrual cramps. Yerba buena also has an impact on our nervous system. It is what's known as a nervine. It is both stimulating and also sedating. So when we think of what it's doing to our body, our muscles, it's relaxing the muscles. So that's sedating, while also having this like minty aromatic quality to it that does help kind of like stimulate blood flow to the brain. So that's where that stimulating aspect comes from. And recently, yerba buena has been getting some attention when it comes to helping support different hormonal irregularities and PCOS. It has been found to reduce different androgen levels like testosterone and DHEA, which I'll talk about what that is in a little bit. But what you need to know is that these levels tend to be higher in those individuals that do have PCOS. And it can also help reduce the symptoms of PCOS. Most commonly is the unwanted body hair, the hormonal acne, and the irregular cycle length by lowering these androgen levels. Now, there has been multiple studies done on the impacts of yerba buena with PCOS. Most notably, though, there was a study that looked at 42 women that took yerba buena twice a day as a tea, and they did find that it did help reduce their testosterone levels. Something that I did forget to mention is that we do naturally produce testosterone, just like those with male bodies do naturally produce estrogen. But the difference is that what we need is a lot less. So we just need a little bit of testosterone for us to ovulate. But when we have increased in testosterone levels, that is where the hormonal dysregulation really comes in. In another study, they actually mixed yerba buena with flax seeds, and it had a really interesting effect because they combined yerba buena's anti-androgen effects with flax seeds' phytoestrogen effects, so pushing down testosterone and then increasing estrogen. And that really helped improve PCOS symptoms. And the reason that researchers think this is happening is because yerba buena is inhibiting a very specific enzyme that does convert testosterone into a stronger form of testosterone, that being the DHT. So if yerba buena is inactivating this stronger testosterone, DHT, that means that androgen levels in general would go down because androgen levels have an impact on estrogen levels. These would then go up, so then there would be less PCOS-like symptoms. Another area that yerba buena can be really beneficial is if you feel a lot of anxiety, and where you feel it in your body is in your stomach. I get that a lot. I get that very specifically in the late follicular pre-ovulation area, which that to me makes sense. When we think of like the archetype of ovulation, that is the time where we have the most energy, the most outward expressing energy, where we have like all of this fuel most of the time. And sometimes all of this ramped up energy can kind of get stuck in the body and make you feel anxious. That is at least the case for me. And I found that yerba buena really helps to kind of like settle the muscles, because that's what it does. Settles the muscles without really sedating the mind, which other herbs do. For instance, chamomile has a really calming effect, but that also calms the mind. So yerba buena is really nice to kind of help wind you down and calm those like butterflies in the stomach sensation that you can have. And the time that I've noticed my anxiety being a little bit more intense is right before lunchtime, which I've been actively working with yerba buena to kind of help mitigate that, because you don't want to be going into your lunchtime feeling anxious. Because when we think of what's happening in our flight or fight response, so we're anxious, we're tensed up, all of that blood flow is going into our extremities because we're ready to like throw down. But that's not really good for our digestive system. We want all of that blood flow to go into the core so that we're able to actually like digest the food and just kind of do all the processes that our body needs to metabolize that food. But if we're in an anxious state, that blood flow is directed elsewhere. So working with Herbalism that way is really good, getting you back into that rest and digest mode before eating your lunch. It can also be really helpful if you have menstrual headaches because it does improve blood flow to the brain. And the way that you know if you're getting menstrual headaches is that you're taking note of kind of like what symptoms you're feeling throughout your cycle and noticing that there is a certain time in your cycle where you get headaches repeatedly. That would then kind of give you insight that it could be hormonally linked. So yerba could be really good to help get blood flow to the brain, kind of relieve some of that tension. I would also pair it with dandelion root, just because when it comes to menstrual hormonal headaches, there is a link to having a more sluggish liver. So it's not able to like really metabolize the hormones that are being used. So having dandelion root paired with yerba would be really beneficial if you do get those menstrual headaches. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, what is really unique about Latin American herbalism is that it is interwoven into everyday life and everyday recipes. So there is a lot of recipes for yerba buena. You can add it to lemonades, agua fresca, salads, soup, meat heavy meals, and my ultimate favorite recipe that I found when I was in Colombia was that they did a lemonade with yerba buena and coconut milk. It is absolutely amazing, and I highly recommend you try it, especially for the summer months. Some important things to note when it comes to yerba buena is that it can make some symptoms worse, notably being acid reflux and GERD. So I would suggest start with a cup, a couple of leaves if you have it fresh, or just a little bit, and just kind of see how your body reacts. Traditionally, one cup is enough because remember, the mentality isn't really that this tea will help me in this specific thing. It's something that you just kind of drink because you were craving it. So it was usually one cup that you have. But in the research that was talking about PCOS, the research in it was 2 cups. So just kind of like experiment, see how you feel with 1 cup, see how you feel with 2 cups, and kind of go off of that. And remember that you can also incorporate it into different recipes, and I feel like it's better incorporated that way. All right, next up is cilantro. And cilantro was the whole reason that I decided to make this video, and actually the whole reason why I decided to look more into Latin American herbalism in the first place. And the reason for that is because as I was kind of like putting my toes into Latin American herbalism, I was first looking into cilantro just because it's so embedded into our culture. And research after resource, I found that people were like, oh yeah, cilantro is enjoyed in things like Asia, in the Mediterranean, and in Mexico. And that kind of like those areas when I was looking at like the history of cilantro kind of kept coming up. Now I was like, okay, but Latin America is more than just Mexico. There's like a whole continent of South America where cilantro is also enjoyed. And that really irritated me that a lot of the Western perspective of herbalism is like, and this is enjoyed in Mexico. And it's like, okay, yes, but what about the other continents underneath all of the Latin American cultures? So that is what really like fueled me into wanting to get more information out there in what Latin American herbalism really is about. So that was like a little side tangent on why I decided to start making more content on Latin American herbalism. So looking at the history of cilantro, there was a lot of indigenous and ancient civilization that used cilantro culinarily while also medicinally. We have accounts from ancient Egypt, from Greece, from Africa, from Iran, and also Rome. And they use cilantro medicinally for digestion to help relieve pain and also as a protective charm. And cilantro was brought over from Europe to South America, where it really got embedded into the culture. Now, when it comes to research on cilantro, Japan did find that cilantro helps the body excrete heavy metals. And because cilantro has this binding effect on heavy metals, I would say that it is better to find a local source when it comes to cilantro, just because since it does have this binding effect, that means that if a soil is contaminated with heavy metals like mercury, it would then be absorbed into the cilantro. And even buying organic isn't a perfect fit because, once again, if that soil is contaminated, which it might just well be just because heavy metals are a natural product here on Earth, then you wouldn't really know. But if you go to like a farmer's market or even grow some yourself, then you'll be able to ask for soil testing, get your soil tested just to make sure that that cilantro isn't already binding with heavy metals. And instead, when you have it incorporated into your diet, you are then getting rid of the heavy metals that are within your own body. All right, there we go. Had to wait until the sun was no longer blinding me. Other notable research that's been done on cilantro is that it helps lower LDL cholesterol, which is the bad cholesterol, and helps increase HDL cholesterol, which is the more beneficial cholesterol. Another study in 2017 found that those that consume cilantro regularly did have lower blood pressure, better overall cardiovascular health, and metabolic balance. And then other research, which I'm going to have to read off of this because this is a mouthful, under the evidence-based complementary and alternative medicine in 2018 found that there's bioactive compounds in cilantro that help enhance immune function by modulating an inflammatory response and protecting cells from damage because of its antioxidant properties. That's the general benefits of having cilantro in the diet. So now let's look at it, how it can support our hormonal health. Cilantro is a good source of magnesium, and as we've talked about before with cacao, magnesium is really good at helping to relax the muscles, which is going to help in reducing painful cramps. So knowing that, the first thing that comes to mind is that during the first 2 to 3 days of our period, when cramps can be a little bit more intense, incorporating cilantro into like a really hearty soup, like a chicken soup or just like a very light soup that you just kind of put some cilantro leaves on top. When before we would think of it as like, oh, it's for added flavor, it can indeed help us in reducing the amount of cramps that we are experiencing. Another reason that you should have cilantro during your period is that it also helps with digestive cramping, which is important during our period because a digestive cramp can then actually trigger a menstrual cramp. You would have experienced this if you ever had a bowel movement cramp that within a couple of seconds just triggers a really intense menstrual cramp. It's similar in that way. And the reason that we can experience a different type of cramp, so a digestive cramp that then turns into a more intense period cramp, is there's something called prostaglandins. So prostaglandins are a type of lipid that helps to stimulate the uterus to contract to be able to shed the lining. And unlike modern medicine likes to think, our uterus doesn't live in a void. It's not just the uterus that is impacted by all of these different chemicals and reactions. So what happens when prostaglandins are increased to be able to shed the menstrual lining is that there's also prostaglandins that are impacting other areas like our digestive system. Because once again, this is contracting our muscles. So ideally, it would have been uterine muscles because of just how our body works. It could then sometimes be digestive muscles. So incorporating more cilantro into our meals will help buffer this effect, while over time helping to reduce the amount of prostaglandins that we have. Because more intense period cramps can be a sign that our prostaglandin levels are a little too high. And luckily for us, cilantro is an integral part to many of our cultural dishes. In fact, when I moved out to my parents' house, it wasn't so much that I was missing cilantro when I was having a meal. It was more of a lack of cilantro that I would notice. Not that it needed cilantro, that there was just a lack of it. So I feel like that itself speaks to just how integral cilantro is into our culture. So now I make sure to always have some on hand so that it's easy for me to just toss them into whatever meals I'm making. All right, now continuing on with other herbs that you wouldn't really think of as herbs is cinnamon. So cinnamon comes from the inner bark of an evergreen tree, and as I was doing research for this video, I found it really surprising how many different varieties of cinnamon there are based on where it's grown. So there is the Vietnamese cinnamon, also known as Saigon. There is Indonesian cinnamon, which I want to say about 70% of the cinnamon that we have is Indonesian cinnamon. There is Malabar cinnamon from South India, Chinese cinnamon, also known as cassia, and this is the type of cinnamon that when we go to a grocery store here in the States, that is the one that we're most likely to find is that Chinese cinnamon. Lastly, we have Ceylon cinnamon coming from Sri Lanka, and that is known as the true cinnamon. Another common name for the cinnamon is Mexican cinnamon. So this is the cinnamon that when we talk about cinnamon in Latin America, this is the one that we're most likely using. So it is a little bit more sweeter and a little bit more mild than the cinnamon that is commonly used here in the state, which is the cassia cinnamon. And because cinnamon is coming from all of these different regions of the world, it was highly valued culinarily, but also medicinally and spiritually as well. And the Spanish were the ones that brought cinnamon over to Mexico in about the 16th century, which could be why it is more commonly known as Mexican cinnamon, even though it is used out through Latin America. And now it is grown in Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Argentina, Chile, and Venezuela. And when it comes to recipe, we can find it in things like arroz con leche, avena, hot chocolate, horchata, natilla. It's added into smoothies, as well as a standalone tea, and incorporated into all kinds of delicious pastries. And luckily for us, one of the main benefits of cinnamon is that it helps in blood sugar regulation. There has been multiple research studies that have looked into how cinnamon impacts our blood sugar regulation, as well as our insulin sensitivity. Now, we did touch on insulin sensitivity when we were talking about cacao, and to expand on that further is that high insulin levels stimulate the ovaries to produce more androgen, like testosterone, which, like as I mentioned, we do naturally need, but we need a certain amount of it. But even a small increase in these androgen levels can then disrupt our hormonal balance by disrupting ovulation itself, which leads to irregular cycles and delayed periods, which this then creates a vicious cycle where higher levels of insulin resistance leads to higher levels of androgens in the body, which then makes insulin resistance even worse by interfering with sugar metabolism. Something else that insulin resistance does is that it does create an environment of chronic inflammation, which of course makes things like insulin resistance as well as androgen levels worse. And once again, cinnamon comes through for us because it helps also reduce inflammation in the body. Research has looked at different phytochemicals and essential oils that seem to interact with our inflammatory pathways, which is why it can help reduce inflammation in the body. So then having known that, that means that adding more cinnamon into the diet can then in turn help with menstrual cramps because higher levels of menstrual cramps can be a sign of just higher chronic inflammation in the body. Because once again, some cramping, some achiness is normal as, of course, the uterine muscles are contracting to shed the lining. But more intense, debilitating pain, that isn't normal, and that is a sign that maybe something else is going on underneath the surface. And something else that I found really interesting when I was doing my research is that other traditional cultures like Chinese medicine and Ayurveda also did use cinnamon for improving PMS symptoms. So there is some ancestral abuelita wisdom into why we're adding cinnamon into many of our delicious pastries and treats. All right, and then finally on the list, but definitely not least, is avena. In Western herbalism, we talk a lot about oat straw and milky oat tops when it comes to medicine made from avena. While in Latin American culture, we value avena itself, oats itself in its entirety, and see it as medicinally. And here in the States, they are valuing how medicinal oats can be, nutritionally wise. But I feel like it's coming from a different perspective, more as a way to highlight avena as like a superfood or something that you kind of have to eat to get all of like the health benefits as a way to biohack your nutrition. Or I've also seen it where it's on the complete opposite side and it's demonized and says that it shouldn't be eaten because it just turns into simple sugars. And even though avena did start out in Europe and Western Asia, it has really taken a life of its own in Latin American culture. Now it's found in horchata, oat smoothies, mazamorra, oat pudding, cookies, breads, cereals, soups, and so much more. So now talking about the benefits of avena is that it's very nutrient dense, nutrient rich. It's a really good source of fiber, having about 4 grams of fiber per serving. And there are different types of oats or different processes of oats, where there can be instant oats, there can be steel cut oats, there can be old fashioned oats. And the ones that I come into more contact with when it comes to recipe wise is old fashioned oats. And those are the ones that have a good amount of fiber in them. And they do have 2 types of fiber. So they have insoluble fiber and also soluble fiber. Soluble fiber helps lower cholesterol and also stabilizes blood sugar levels, while insoluble fiber helps with regular bowel movements. And this part's important to us because having regular bowel movements is really important and kind of one of the more foundational things when we talk about hormonal balance. Because through these bowel movements is how we get rid of the used up and excess hormones from our bodies. When we are not having regular bowel movements, so we're constipated 2 to 3 days as like our norm, that means that those hormones that are no longer needed in use are just kind of like staying there in the body. And at times that can then be reintroduced into the bloodstream, which then impact our hormonal levels. I also want to note that we don't get enough fiber in our diet in like the Western world. We are chronically low on fiber, so incorporating more fiber whenever we can is really beneficial. And because avena does have these 2 types of fiber, it also means that it is really good for our gut microbiome. The nutrients fiber in avena help feed the beneficial bacteria that is in our gut. as well as supporting our digestive mucosa that kind of lines our digestive system, which this is really good because it helps with issues of intestinal permeability, also known as leaky gut. And when we relate that back to our hormonal health, our digestive system, once again, is that foundational piece to having hormonal balance. Because it doesn't matter if we're eating all the quote right things if our body isn't able to absorb it based on our gut microbiome. Because at the end of the day, we are not what we eat, but what we digest instead. And Avena is really good for our blood sugar overall because it is a complex carb, meaning that it does take longer for our bodies to digest it, which means that our blood sugar levels are regularly stable, which means that it's really filling. So when I think of that and relating that to my hormonal health, I'm thinking of having that in my late luteal phase. How amazing that would be. Because it is warming, it is hearty, and it is also light for that late luteal when you start to feel kind of like crampy, kind of like when you're on the verge of your period. So you're feeling a little bit more bloated, a little bit more achy, having that as a comfort food, adding in some bananas, some fruits, or having it as just like avena in the drink form and a hot drink form. That would be really good. And I feel like that would just be really cozy in that like late luteal time. All right, so that was a couple of different herbs that kind of came to mind when I thought of Latin American herbalism and Latin American herbalism in general, because I feel like there's not that much information on Latin American herbalism, similarly to menstrual health and hormonal health. So having a video that kind of crosses both of those has been super cool, and I feel like this knowledge should become a little bit more mainstream. And just because these topics aren't really talked about within our own cultures doesn't mean that we shouldn't learn about them and then share that knowledge with others as well. And I found a real homecoming in realizing how integrated herbalism is into our everyday life in our culture. Because when I thought about herbalism in Latin America, nothing really came to mind until I sat down. I'm like, wait, they're interwoven into just our everyday existence. And that's something that needs to be cherished and also explored about more as we try to understand our culture and our traditions and bringing them more into the present moment. And I would love to hear from you guys. I would love to know what different cultural plates that you guys incorporate these different herbs to. What were your thoughts on menstrual health, hormonal health growing up? I would just love to know like how this landed for you. Thank you so much for hanging out with me all the way to the end of this video and see you next time.